Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true Washington State rainforest horror stories that will make you question what really lurks beneath the moss-covered canopy of the Pacific Northwest. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters shared by people who ventured into some of the wettest and most isolated temperate rainforests in North America. Each account has been meticulously gathered from first-hand testimonials and corroborated through witness statements and documented evidence. The ancient forests of Washington hold mysteries that defy rational explanation, and perhaps some things are better left undiscovered. If you enjoy genuine horror content that explores the darkness between the trees, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unexplained. After you listen to these haunting accounts tonight, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own experiences with the unknown. Now settle in as we journey deep into the rainforests, where few dare to wander and even fewer return unchanged. Addison had never been particularly fond of solo hiking. The idea of venturing alone into remote wilderness had always struck her as unnecessarily risky, the kind of thing that sounded romantic in theory, but unsettling in practice. She preferred companionship on trails, the comfort of another voice to fill the silence between footsteps, another set of eyes to catch what she might miss. But the Hoh River Trail in Olympic National Park had been calling to her for years, appearing in photographs on social media feeds and travel blogs with such frequency that it felt almost inevitable. The images were always the same: massive moss-draped trees rising like ancient pillars, emerald undergrowth glowing in filtered sunlight, and the promise of solitude in one of the most unique ecosystems in the continental United States. Circa 2019, in late October, Addison finally made the decision. She had a long weekend free from work, her usual hiking partners were unavailable, and the weather forecast for the Olympic Peninsula showed a rare stretch of dry days. She loaded her backpack with essentials, drove the 3.5 hours from Seattle to the park, and arrived at the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center just as the afternoon light was beginning to soften. The ranger on duty warned her that sunset would come early this time of year, especially beneath the dense canopy, and suggested she start early the next morning instead. But Addison had driven too far to wait, and she assured the ranger she would only hike a few miles before turning back. The trailhead was busier than she expected, even for a late October afternoon. Families with young children clustered near the hull of Moss's Loop, cameras clicking at every fantastical tree formation. Addison shouldered her pack and moved past them, following the signs for the Hoh River Trail proper. Within minutes, the crowds thinned, and within another half-mile, she was completely alone. The trail itself was not particularly isolated by Olympic National Park standards. It was well maintained, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and saw moderate foot traffic even in the off-season. But Addison had arrived late, and by the time she reached the 3-mile mark, the ancient forest had already begun to swallow the fading daylight. The Hoh Rainforest has a reputation for being one of the wettest places in the continental United States, receiving upwards of 12 to 14 feet of rain annually. The air hung thick with moisture, clinging to Addison's skin and hair, making every breath feel heavy and saturated. Massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks rose like cathedral columns around her, their trunks wrapped in vibrant green moss that seemed to glow even in the dim light. Nurse logs, fallen giants slowly decomposing back into the earth, stretched across the forest floor, their surfaces covered in ferns, seedlings, and more moss. Everything was green, impossibly green, and alive in a way that felt almost overwhelming. Addison had read about the area's beauty extensively before making the trip, studied photographs until she felt she knew every angle and perspective. But nothing had prepared her for how alive the forest felt, how it seemed to breathe around her with every step. The sound of the Ho River was a constant presence somewhere to her right, a low rushing whisper that ebbed and flowed depending on the trail's proximity to the water. Bird calls echoed from high in the canopy, and occasionally she would catch the skittering of small animals in the underbrush. The forest was alive, yes, but it was also watching. That thought crept into Addison's mind, unbidden around mile 3, and once it arrived, she could not shake it. She told herself it was just the unfamiliarity of the environment, the natural unease that comes from being alone in a place so vast and ancient. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. She began glancing over her shoulder more frequently, scanning the spaces between trees, looking for movement where there should be none. There was nothing, of course, just moss and ferns, and the endless towering trunks of trees that had been growing long before she was born and would continue growing long after she was gone. Around mile 4, Addison noticed something unusual. Between the Douglas firs to her left, approximately 30 yards off the trail, she saw what appeared to be a figure standing perfectly still. At first, she assumed it was another hiker who had wandered off the path, perhaps to take a photograph or answer a call of nature. But as she stopped to look closer, she realized the figure was not moving at all, not shifting weight from one foot to the other, not looking around, not adjusting a backpack or checking a phone. Just standing there, facing her direction, completely motionless. Addison called out, her voice sounding strange and small in the vastness of the forest. She asked if the person needed help, if they were lost, if everything was okay. There was no response. The figure remained perfectly still, a dark silhouette against the green backdrop of ferns and moss. Addison felt her heart rate increase, felt the first prickle of genuine unease run down her spine. She tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Perhaps it was a stump, an oddly shaped tree trunk, or a peculiar arrangement of branches that from this angle looked human. The forest was full of such optical illusions, after all, shapes that the human brain desperately tried to interpret as familiar patterns. She rubbed her eyes, blinked several times, and looked again. The figure was still there. Tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and arms hanging at its sides. The proportions were unmistakably human. Addison took a step forward, intending to get a better look, to confirm once and for all whether she was seeing a person or a trick of light and shadow. That was when the figure moved. It was not a dramatic movement, not a wave or a turn. It simply took one slow, deliberate step to the side, moving behind a wider tree trunk and disappearing from view. Addison's breath caught in her throat. Whatever she had been looking at, it had just proven itself to be very real and very much alive. She stood frozen on the trail, flashlight now clutched tightly in her hand, despite the fact that there was still enough ambient light to see. She waited, listening for footsteps, for the sound of someone moving through the undergrowth. There was nothing. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. Addison became acutely aware of the silence in that moment. The bird calls had stopped. The rustling of small animals in the undergrowth had ceased. Even the sound of the Ho River seemed muted, distant, as though someone had turned down the volume on the entire world. All she could hear was her own breathing and the pounding of her heart in her ears. She continued to stare at the spot where the figure had disappeared, willing it to reappear, to reveal itself as nothing more than a confused hiker or a park employee conducting some kind of survey. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. Addison saw movement again. This time, The figure was closer, perhaps only 20 yards away, standing behind a moss-covered fallen log. It was watching her. She could feel it even though she could not make out any facial features or details in the growing darkness. The realization that this thing, whatever it was, had moved significantly closer without making a sound, sent a wave of primal fear through Addison's entire body. She did not wait to see what it would do next. She did not call out again or try to take a photograph or attempt any form of communication. Addison simply turned on her heel and began walking briskly back down the trail, forcing herself not to run, not to give in to the panic that was clawing at the edges of her consciousness. Running would be worse, she told herself. Running would signal prey behavior, would trigger some kind of chase instinct if this was an animal or, God forbid, a person with bad intentions. Every few steps, Addison would glance over her shoulder, and each time she did, her heart sank a little further. The figure was still there, moving parallel to her through the trees, keeping pace but never stepping onto the trail itself. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, gliding between the ancient trunks as though the dense undergrowth, the fallen logs, the thick carpet of ferns did not exist for it. There was no sound of footsteps, no snapping of branches, no rustling of vegetation. It simply moved, a dark shape among darker shadows, always there, always watching. Addison picked up her pace, her walk becoming a jog, her jog threatening to break into a full sprint. She no longer cared about appearing calm or rational. She just needed to get back to the trailhead, back to her car, back to civilization where things like this did not happen. The trail felt impossibly long, each bend and turn revealing only more forest, more moss-covered trees, more shadows where something could be hiding. She kept checking over her shoulder, and the figure kept pace, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. By the time Addison finally burst out of the forest and into the parking area near the visitor center, the sun had fully set. The sky was a deep purple, stars just beginning to appear overhead. The parking lot was nearly empty, just her vehicle and one other car that presumably belonged to the ranger closing up the visitor center. Addison ran to her car, fumbling with her keys, hands shaking so badly she dropped them twice before finally managing to unlock the door. She threw herself into the driver's seat and immediately locked all the doors, gasping for breath, heart pounding so hard she thought she might be sick. For several minutes, she just sat there, trying to calm down, trying to convince herself that she had overreacted, that what she had seen was nothing more than another hiker or perhaps a large animal, a bear or an elk that had looked humanoid in the failing light. But even as she tried to rationalize it, Addison knew in her gut that what she had seen was neither human nor animal. It was something else, something that did not belong to any category her mind could comfortably accept. As she sat there catching her breath, Addison's headlights automatically turned on, triggered by the darkness. The beam swept across the parking lot and illuminated the edge of the forest at the far end. And there, standing just beyond the tree line, exactly where the light met the shadows, was the figure. It stood motionless, watching her, just as it had been doing for the last 2 miles. Addison could see it more clearly now in the harsh, artificial light. Tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs and a shape that was almost human, but not quite. The proportions were wrong somehow. The arms too long, the torso too narrow, the head tilted at an angle that made her skin crawl. She did not hesitate. Addison started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and backed out of the parking space with more speed than was probably safe. She did not look in her rearview mirror, did not check to see if the figure was still there or if it had moved. She simply drove, following the park road back to the highway, then the highway back towards Seattle, putting as many miles as possible between herself and the Hoh Rainforest. Addison has never returned to the Hoh River Trail. She has tried to research what she saw, spent hours on paranormal forums and hiking websites looking for similar accounts, but found nothing that quite matched her experience. There are stories of strange sightings in the Pacific Northwest, of course. Bigfoot reports, skinwalker legends, tales of shadow people and missing hikers. But none of them captured exactly what she had witnessed that day. The silent watcher that moved through the ancient forest like it owned the place, like it had been there long before the trees themselves. To this day, years later, Addison cannot fully explain what she saw in those ancient woods. She knows it was real, knows she was not hallucinating or mistaken. The memory is too vivid, too detailed, burned into her consciousness with the clarity that only genuine fear can provide. Sometimes, late at night when she cannot sleep, she wonders if the figure is still there, still watching the trail, waiting for the next person to wander just a little too far into its territory. And she wonders, with a shiver that has nothing to do with the temperature, what would have happened if she had not turned back when she did? If she had continued deeper into the forest as the sun set and the shadows grew long? If anyone has had a similar experience on the Hoh River Trail or elsewhere in Olympic National Park, if anyone has seen the tall figure that moves without sound through the moss-draped trees, Addison would very much like to hear about it. Not because she needs validation, she knows what she saw was real, but because she would like to know that she was not the only one, that others have encountered this thing and lived to tell about it. And perhaps, just perhaps, someone out there knows what it is and why it watches from the shadows of the Hoh Rainforest. Ryan had been working as a forestry technician in the Kino Rainforest for nearly 5 years when the incident occurred. The position had been perfect for him, a combination of scientific work and outdoor solitude that suited his personality far better than the office jobs his college degree had initially qualified him for. The Kino area of Olympic National Forest is known for its record-breaking rainfall, receiving an average of 12 feet of precipitation annually, and for being home to some of the largest trees in the world. The western red cedars and Sitka spruces in the valley bottom reached heights that seemed to defy physics, towering over the forest floor like ancient monuments to a time before human civilization. Ryan's job often required him to hike deep into the backcountry to collect data on tree growth patterns, soil composition, and wildlife activity. He would spend days, or sometimes weeks, alone in the forest, setting up temporary camps and methodically working through his assigned survey areas. He was accustomed to solitude in a way that most people never experience, comfortable with the sounds of the forest and the particular quality of silence that exists beneath a rainforest canopy. He had spent countless nights alone in remote areas without incident, had grown familiar with the calls of Roosevelt elk, the rustling of black bears in the underbrush, and the strange acoustics that heavy moss and dense vegetation create. That all changed in the autumn of 2017. Ryan had set up camp near the shores of Quinault Lake, several miles from the nearest road and well beyond the areas frequented by recreational hikers. The lake itself was stunning, a glacially carved body of water surrounded by mountains and fed by dozens of streams that tumbled down from the high country. The area he had chosen for his base camp was on the less developed eastern shore, where old growth forest grew right down to the water's edge. He had pitched his tent in a small clearing, close enough to the lake to hear the gentle lapping of water against the shore, far enough into the trees to have shelter from the wind that occasionally swept down from the mountains. The forecast had called for rain, which was not unusual for October in the Kino Valley. Ryan had come prepared with extra tarps, waterproof gear, and enough supplies to last him 2 weeks, if necessary. His research objectives were straightforward: document the health and growth rates of old-growth cedars in a specific watershed, collect soil samples from various elevations, and note any signs of disease or pest infestation. It was routine work, the kind of thing he had done dozens of times before in dozens of different locations throughout the Olympic Peninsula. On his second night at the lake, Ryan woke to the sound of voices. The experience was disorienting at first, that half-conscious state between sleep and wakefulness, where the mind struggles to place unfamiliar sounds in familiar contexts. At first, he thought it was other campers, though he had not seen anyone else in the area. And technically, this section of forest required special permits that limited the number of people allowed in at any given time. Ryan checked his watch. It was just past 2 in the morning, an unusual time for conversations in the backcountry. The voices were muffled, distant, but definitely human. They seemed to be speaking in conversation, though Ryan could not make out any distinct words. The sound had a strange quality to it, as though it was being filtered through water or heard from inside a building while the speakers were outside. He lay in his sleeping bag for several minutes, listening, trying to determine the direction and distance of the voices. They seemed to be coming from the direction of the lake, perhaps from the shore or from somewhere out on the water itself. Ryan unzipped his tent and looked around, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the light rain that had begun to fall, illuminating millions of tiny droplets suspended in the air. The voices stopped immediately, as though someone had flipped a switch. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the voices themselves. Ryan swept the flashlight beam across the campsite, into the trees, toward the lake. Nothing moved. There was no sign of anyone else in the area. Assuming he had imagined it, or that the wind had been playing tricks on him, Ryan went back to sleep. The following night, the voices returned, but this time, they were closer. Ryan sat up in his sleeping bag the moment he heard them. Instantly awake, all thoughts of sleep evaporating. There were at least 3 distinct voices, maybe more, all speaking at once, but not to each other. It sounded like overlapping conversations, fragments of sentences layered on top of one another in a way that should not have been possible. Ryan could almost make out individual words now. Almost, but not quite. It was like listening to a radio station that was slightly off frequency, where you can hear that there are words being spoken but cannot quite tune in enough to understand them. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside his tent, pulling on his rain jacket as he went. The voices continued, coming from the direction of the lake, and now that he was outside and fully awake, Ryan was certain they were not a product of his imagination. He walked toward the shore, his boots squelching in the wet moss and mud that covered the forest floor. The rain had picked up, a steady drizzle that was typical for the area, and the droplets made soft pattering sounds as they hit the leaves and his jacket. But beneath that sound, the voices continued, growing louder as Ryan approached the water. He walked slowly, carefully, shining his light ahead of him and scanning the trees on either side. The forest at night is a different place than it is during the day. Familiar landmarks becoming strange and distorted, shadows taking on shapes that the rational mind knows are not real, but the primitive brain insists on interpreting as threats. Ryan had spent enough time in the woods to be comfortable with this transformation, but something about the voices made him uneasy in a way he had never experienced before. As he approached the shore, the voices grew louder, more insistent, but still incomprehensible. They seemed to be all around him now, coming from multiple directions at once. Ryan stepped out onto the narrow, rocky beach that bordered this section of the lake, the water lapping gently at his boots. He swept his flashlight beam across the surface of the lake, looking for boats or kayaks or any sign of other people. The lake was perfectly calm, its surface reflecting the beam of his light like dark glass. Then, abruptly, the voices stopped. Ryan stood alone in the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through the rain, his breath coming faster than it should have been. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no animals, no sound of water against the shore. It was as though someone had placed the entire world inside a soundproof box. Ryan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, felt a primal warning signal firing in some ancient part of his brain that existed long before humans developed language or rational thought. He swept the flashlight beam across the lake one more time, and that is when he saw them. Across the water, perhaps 50 yards away, were several pale figures standing at the edge of the opposite shore. They were humanoid in shape, but something about their proportions seemed wrong, off in a way that Ryan's mind struggled to process. They stood motionless, facing his direction, and even at this distance, even in the darkness and rain, Ryan could tell they were watching him. A cold dread settled over Ryan, the kind of fear that bypasses rational thought and goes straight to the survival centers of the brain. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to move, to run, to get away from the shore and these figures and this unnatural silence. He backed away from the water, not taking his eyes off the figures across the lake. As he retreated, they began to move. The figures stepped into the water and began wading toward him. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and completely silent. Ryan watched in horror as they moved deeper into the lake, the water rising to their waists, then their chests. But they kept coming. They showed no signs of swimming, no attempt to stay afloat, just a steady, relentless progression through the water, as though they were walking on solid ground beneath the surface. Ryan did not wait to see what would happen when they reached his side of the lake. He turned and ran back to his camp, crashing through the undergrowth with no regard for the noise he was making or the equipment he might be damaging. His hands shook as he tore down his tent, stuffing everything into his pack with no attempt at organization or care. He did not care about leaving things behind, did not care about his research objectives or the data he had spent 3 days collecting. He just needed to leave. As Ryan worked frantically to pack his gear, he could hear the voices again. They were coming from multiple directions now, surrounding him in the forest, always just out of sight, always just at the edge of his flashlight beam. They followed him as he shouldered his pack and started down the trail toward the road. Always present, always speaking in that unsettling, overlapping cadence. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, layering on top of each other until they created a sound that was almost musical in its dissonance. Ryan hiked through the darkness for hours, using his headlamp to navigate the trail, moving as quickly as he dared on the slippery, root-covered path. The voices followed him for miles, sometimes fading into the distance, sometimes growing so loud that they seemed to be coming from right behind him. He would spin around, swinging his light beam into the forest, but there was never anything there. Just trees and moss and rain and darkness. It was not until Ryan reached his truck, parked at the trailhead where he had left it 3 days earlier, that the voices finally stopped. The moment he stepped onto the gravel parking area, the moment his feet touched ground that had been cleared and maintained by the Forest Service, the voices ceased. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the voices themselves. Ryan stood in the parking lot, gasping for breath, his heart pounding, his hands still shaking as he fumbled for his keys. He threw his pack into the truck bed, climbed into the cab, and locked the doors. For several minutes, he just sat there, engine running, heater blasting, trying to process what had just happened. The rationale part of his mind, the part that had been trained in scientific method and empirical observation, wanted to find an explanation. Auditory hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation. The acoustics of the lake playing tricks with sounds from miles away. Some kind of wildlife vocalization he had never heard before. But Ryan knew, in the same way Addison had known on the Hoh River Trail, that what he had experienced was not something that could be easily explained or rationalized. He reported the incident to the Park Service the following day, carefully describing what he had heard and seen without editorializing or speculating about what it might have been. The ranger he spoke with listened politely, took notes, and assured Ryan that they would look into it. But Ryan could see the skepticism in the ranger's eyes, could sense that his report would be filed away and forgotten, just another strange story from the backcountry that could not be verified or explained. No explanation was ever found. No other forestry technicians or hikers reported similar experiences in that area. Or, if they did, those reports were not shared with Ryan. He requested a transfer to a different forest district shortly after, citing personal reasons. His supervisor was understanding, perhaps more understanding than Ryan had expected, which made him wonder if he was not the first person to request a transfer after spending time in the Quinault backcountry. Ryan has never returned to the Quinault Rainforest. His career in forestry continues, but he now works in the drier, more open forests east of the Cascades, where the trees are smaller and the undergrowth is thinner, and the sound of voices carries clearly enough that you can tell whether they are human or something else. He still thinks about that night by the lake, still wonders what those figures in the water were and what they wanted. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing and he is alone in his tent, he thinks he can hear the voices again, distant and overlapping, speaking words he can almost but not quite understand. Lucy and Christopher had been dating for just over a year when they decided to take a weekend camping trip to the Carbon River area of Mount Rainier National Park in early spring of 2018. Both were experienced hikers and had visited the park multiple times, though never together. The decision to finally make the trip as a couple had been spontaneous, born from a rare alignment of free weekends and favorable weather forecasts. The Carbon River region is one of the more remote sections of the park, characterized by dense temperate rainforest, glacier-fed rivers, and significantly fewer crowds than the more popular Paradise or Sunrise areas. For Lucy and Christopher, this isolation was part of the appeal. They set up camp near the Carbon River, in a designated backcountry site that required a wilderness permit. The area was breathtaking in a way that photographs could never quite capture. Massive old growth cedars and hemlocks towered overhead, their trunks so wide that it would take several people holding hands to encircle them. The branches were draped with hanging moss that swayed gently in the breeze, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. The river itself was a milky gray-blue color, fed by the Carbon Glacier several miles upstream. And the sound of rushing water provided a constant ambient backdrop to their conversations. On their second day, after a morning spent exploring the maintained trails near their campsite, Lucy and Christopher decided to venture off trail. They were both confident in their navigation skills, carried GPS devices and compasses, and knew enough about leave-no-trace principles to minimize their impact on the pristine environment. They wanted to explore a section of forest that looked particularly ancient and untouched. A dense grove visible from one of the viewpoints, but not accessible by any maintained path. After about an hour of careful bushwhacking through dense undergrowth, stepping over fallen logs and navigating around thickets of Devil's Club, they stumbled upon a clearing that seemed distinctly out of place. The trees here were thinner, younger, predominantly alders, and smaller conifers rather than the massive old growth that dominated the surrounding forest. It was as though this particular patch of land had been cleared at some point in the past few decades, and the forest was only now beginning to reclaim it. The ground was uneven, covered in thick moss and scattered with decaying logs. But there was something about the topography that caught Christopher's attention. In the center of the clearing were several mounds of disturbed earth, each roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The dimensions were too regular to be natural, too uniform to be the random work of erosion or animal activity. The soil covering the mounds was darker than the surrounding ground, rich and loamy in a way that suggested it had been turned over relatively recently in geological terms. Small saplings had begun to grow on top of some of the mounds, their roots digging into the disturbed earth. But they were young trees, perhaps only 10 or 15 years old. Christopher knelt down beside one of the mounds, his curiosity overcoming the vague sense of unease that had been growing since they entered the clearing. As he brushed away some of the moss and surface debris, his hand touched something that made his blood run cold. Partially exposed in the dirt was a piece of fabric, dark blue and tattered by time and moisture, but unmistakably synthetic. It was part of a jacket or shirt, the kind of weatherproof material hikers and outdoor enthusiasts wear. Christopher pulled his hand back, as though he had touched something hot. He called Lucy over, keeping his voice low despite the fact that they were miles from anyone else. Together they examined the site more closely, moving carefully around the clearing, counting the mounds. There were at least 7, possibly 8, depending on whether some of the smaller disturbances in the ground qualified. All were roughly the same size and shape. All were arranged in no particular pattern, scattered across the clearing as though placed there at different times by someone who was not concerned with organization or symmetry. Lucy noticed something else that made the situation even more disturbing. On several of the trees surrounding the clearing, there were carvings. These were not typical trail graffiti, not initials in hearts or crude drawings. These were deliberate, detailed carvings of faces. Each face was different, some appearing masculine, others feminine, some that could have been either. But they all shared one common feature that sent chills down Lucy's spine. Every single face had its eyes closed, as though sleeping or dead. The carvings were weathered, the cuts in the bark partially healed over and covered with moss in places, but they were still clearly visible. They were all positioned at roughly the same height, about 5 feet off the ground, at eye level for an average person standing in the clearing. Christopher suggested they leave immediately and report what they had found to the park rangers. The implications of what they were looking at were too serious to ignore, too potentially significant to simply walk away from without telling anyone. Lucy agreed without hesitation. They quickly marked their route as best they could, using Christopher's GPS to record the exact coordinates of the clearing, and made their way back to their campsite. Neither of them spoke much during the hike back. The discovery had cast a shadow over what had been a perfect weekend, transforming their romantic camping trip into something that felt heavy and wrong. That evening, they contacted the Park Service using the emergency contact number on their wilderness permit. They explained what they had discovered, carefully describing the location, the mounds, the fabric, and the carvings. The ranger they spoke with asked several pointed questions about the exact location and what specifically they had seen. There was something in the ranger's tone that suggested this was not the first time someone had reported something unusual in that area, though the ranger would not confirm or deny that impression. A ranger arrived at their campsite the following morning, earlier than Lucy and Christopher had expected. The ranger was accompanied by another official whose role was not immediately clear, someone who carried themselves with the bearing of law enforcement but wore civilian clothes rather than a Park Service uniform. Lucy and Christopher led them back to the clearing, following their GPS coordinates and the subtle markers they had left the previous day. The hike took longer than it had the first time, nearly 2 hours instead of 1. But eventually, they found the spot. The rangers' expression shifted from professional skepticism to genuine alarm as they examined the site. The second official immediately began taking photographs and making phone calls on a satellite phone. Within hours, the clearing was swarming with people. Forensics teams, more rangers, individuals and FBI windbreakers, all descending on this remote section of Mount Rainier National Park with an urgency that confirmed Lucy and Christopher's worst fears about what they had found. Over the following weeks, the story made regional news, though the details were carefully controlled by law enforcement. The mounds were indeed graves, and investigators uncovered the remains of multiple individuals who had been buried there over a span of at least a decade. The identities of the victims were never fully disclosed to the public, cited as part of an ongoing investigation. But reporters managed to connect the discoveries to several cold cases of missing persons in the Pacific Northwest. The investigation led to multiple arrests, though again, the specifics were kept confidential. Lucy and Christopher were commended by the Park Service for their discovery and their careful handling of the situation. They were told they had potentially brought closure to multiple families who had spent years not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. But the commendation felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of what those mounds represented. Both Lucy and Christopher found themselves unable to enjoy the outdoors the way they once had. Every clearing looked suspicious. Every oddly placed tree or disturbed patch of ground made them wonder what might be hidden beneath the surface. They have not returned to Mount Rainier National Park since that weekend. The memory of those carved faces still appears in their nightmares, those closed eyes seeming to follow them even in sleep. Christopher has considered selling his camping equipment multiple times, has thought about finding new hobbies that do not involve venturing into remote wilderness areas. Lucy has been in therapy, working through the guilt she feels about being relieved. They left when they did. About being grateful they only found the graves rather than stumbling upon whoever had dug them. The case officially remains open, though no further arrests have been publicized. The section of forest where the clearing was located has been closed to the public indefinitely, cordoned off and marked with warnings about ongoing law enforcement activity. Local hiking forums occasionally discuss the incident, always in hushed tones, always with incomplete information. Some claim to know more than they are saying. Others dismiss the whole thing as an overblown response to a misunderstanding. But Lucy and Christopher know what they saw, know what they found, and know that the beautiful forests of the Pacific Northwest can hide darkness that most people never imagine exists. Penelope had moved to the small town of Forks, Washington in the summer of 2020, drawn by the promise of affordable housing and the quiet beauty of the Olympic Peninsula. The decision had been partially practical and partially romantic. Her job as a software developer allowed her to work remotely, and after years of living in overpriced apartments in Seattle, the idea of owning a house with actual land around it had been too appealing to resist. Forks is best known as the setting for the Twilight series. But beyond the vampire tourism that briefly peaks during summer months, it is fundamentally a logging town surrounded by some of the densest temperate rainforest in North America. The house Penelope purchased was a modest 2-bedroom structure on the outskirts of town, backed by several acres of forest that technically belonged to her property, but felt more like borrowed wilderness. The trees were massive, primarily old-growth western red cedars and Sitka spruces that had likely been standing for centuries. The property had been on the market for months before Penelope made her offer, priced well below comparable homes in the area. The real estate agent had mentioned something about the previous owners moving out of state for work. But there was a vague quality to the explanation that Penelope only later recognized as deliberately evasive. Penelope worked from home and enjoyed the solitude in a way that surprised her. After years of urban living, of constant noise and neighbors separated only by thin walls, the quiet of the forest was a revelation. She often took evening walks through the trails near her property, narrow paths that wound through the undergrowth and connected various homes in the area. The main trail was short, less than a mile, and looped back to her driveway. It became part of her daily routine, a way to decompress after hours spent staring at computer screens and participating in video conferences. One night in late November, Penelope was walking her usual route through a section of old-growth forest behind her house. November in Forks meant early darkness, rain that ranged from drizzle to downpour, and temperatures that hovered just above freezing. The trail was well maintained enough that Penelope felt comfortable walking it even after dark, though she always brought a flashlight and her phone. It was around 8 in the evening when she set out, later than usual but still within her comfort zone. The forest was already pitch black, the dense canopy blocking out whatever ambient light might have been provided by the moon or stars. She was about halfway through the loop, at a point where the trail ran parallel to a small creek, when her flashlight began to flicker. At first, Penelope thought it was just the batteries dying, a common enough occurrence that she always kept spares in her jacket pocket. But before she could stop to change them, the flashlight went out completely. She stood in absolute darkness, fumbling with the battery compartment, when she noticed something ahead of her on the trail. A faint glow, soft and bluish-white in color, roughly the size of a basketball. It was hovering about 3 feet off the ground, moving slowly along the trail away from her, as though it were being carried by an invisible person. The light had an ethereal quality to it, not harsh like a flashlight or warm like a lantern, but something else entirely. It seemed to emanate from within itself, a self-contained sphere of illumination that cast no shadows and created no reflection on the wet surfaces around it. Penelope stood frozen, her dead flashlight forgotten in her hands. Her first thought was that it must be another person, someone with some kind of unusual light source. But even as she formed that thought, she knew it was wrong. The light moved with a fluidity that did not match human walking patterns. It drifted, almost floating, maintaining a consistent height above the trail surface, even as the ground itself rose and fell. As Penelope watched, the light paused as if sensing her presence, as if considering what to do next. Then, slowly, deliberately, the light began to drift off the trail and into the forest. It moved between the massive trunks of the old cedars, weaving around them with impossible grace, never once catching on branches or being blocked by undergrowth. As it passed near trees, Penelope could see them illuminated in that strange bluish glow, the moss on their trunks appearing to shimmer, the ferns on the forest floor casting faint shadows that disappeared as soon as the light moved on. Penelope felt an inexplicable pull to follow the light. Every rational part of her mind was screaming that this was a bad idea, that following mysterious lights into the forest was exactly the kind of thing that ended badly in every story and film she had ever encountered. But there was something about the light itself, something in the way it moved, that suggested not danger, but invitation. Against her better judgment, she stepped off the trail and into the undergrowth. The forest floor was soft beneath her feet, centuries of decomposed organic matter creating a spongy surface that absorbed sound and made walking almost silent. Penelope moved slowly, carefully, keeping her eyes fixed on the light ahead of her. It continued to drift deeper into the forest, always maintaining roughly the same distance from her. Close enough that she could follow, but far enough that she could never quite catch up. The light moved smoothly between the trees, over fallen logs that Penelope had to scramble across, around thickets of salal and Oregon grape that tore at her clothing. She had no idea how long she followed the light. Time seemed to lose meaning in the darkness, with only that blue-white glow to orient herself. It could have been 5 minutes or 50. Eventually, the light stopped in front of a particularly large western red cedar, one of those ancient giants whose trunk was so massive it would take several people holding hands to encircle it. Penelope approached cautiously, her heart pounding, unsure what she would find. As she got closer, she noticed something carved into the bark of the tree. The carving was old, the cuts in the bark partially healed over, but still clearly legible. It was a name, followed by a date from nearly 40 years earlier. Below the name was a short message, carved in letters that had been carefully, deliberately formed. The message read simply, "I am still here." Penelope stood before the tree, reading and rereading those 4 words, trying to understand what they meant. The light remained motionless beside her, illuminating the carving, making sure she could see every detail. Before she could process what she was looking at, before she could pull out her phone to take a photograph or record the exact location, the light suddenly shot upward into the canopy. It moved with incredible speed, streaking through the branches like a comet, and then vanished completely, plunging the forest back into absolute darkness. Her flashlight flickered back to life in her hand, the beam cutting through the darkness as though it had never failed. Penelope stood alone in the forest, heart racing, surrounded by trees and shadows and the distant sound of the creek. She looked up at the carved message one more time, using her flashlight to confirm it was real, then hurried back toward where she thought the trail should be. She navigated by memory and the dim beam of her light, stumbling over roots and pushing through underbrush, until finally she found the familiar packed dirt of the trail. She practically ran the rest of the way back to her house. Once inside, doors locked and lights blazing, Penelope sat at her computer and began to research. She typed the name from the carving into search engines, adding Forks, Washington, and missing person to the query. It took less than 10 minutes to find what she was looking for. The name belonged to a young man who had gone missing in the area in the early 1980s. He had been a logger, working in the forests around Forks, and had simply failed to return home one evening after his shift. Search parties had combed the area for weeks, but his body was never found. The case had eventually gone cold, classified as a probable accident in terrain where bodies could remain hidden indefinitely beneath layers of moss and fallen timber. Penelope printed out the article, which included a photograph of the missing man. He had been 24 years old when he disappeared, younger than Penelope was now. The article mentioned that his family had never stopped looking for answers, had spent decades hoping for some kind of closure. As Penelope read, she realized that the coordinates of her property, the section of forest where she had followed the light, fell within the general search area that had been covered back in 1982. She has seen the light several times since that first encounter. It always appears in the same section of forest, always moves with that same purposeful drift, always seems to be leading somewhere or trying to communicate something. Penelope has stopped following it. The first time had been enough, the message on the tree clear enough that she did not need further confirmation. She had considered reporting the location to authorities. But what would she tell them? That a mysterious light had led her to a tree with a carved message that might indicate where a body was located. she had no proof. No way to explain how she had found it without sounding like she was either lying or losing her grip on reality. Instead, Penelope has made peace with the light. She thinks of it as a kind of guardian, a remnant of the young logger who disappeared so long ago, still trying to make his presence known, still hoping that someone will find what is left of him and bring closure to the family that never stopped searching. On nights when she walks the trail and sees the glow between the trees, Penelope stops and acknowledges it, sometimes speaking aloud to the darkness, telling the light that she sees it, that she knows it is there, that it is not forgotten. The forest around Forks holds many secrets, layers of history written in fallen timber and moss-covered stones. Penelope has come to understand that she is living in a place where the boundary between the living and whatever comes after is thinner than in most places, where the dead sometimes linger not out of malice, but out of need. The light beneath the canopy is not threatening, not dangerous, but it is insistent. It wants to be remembered, wants to be found. And Penelope suspects that one day, perhaps when she is braver or when the time is right, she will follow it again and discover what really happened in those woods 40 years ago. Nathan and Stella had been married for 3 years when they decided to take a belated honeymoon trip to Lake Crescent in Olympic National Park. The original plan had been to travel abroad, perhaps to Europe or Southeast Asia, destinations they had pinned to digital maps and bookmarked in travel blogs during the excitement of their engagement. But financial constraints and demanding work schedules had delayed their plans year after year, until the idea of international travel began to feel more like a burden than a joy. Lake Crescent, with its crystal clear waters and surrounding rainforest, seemed like the perfect compromise. It was close enough to drive from their home in Tacoma, affordable enough that they would not spend months recovering financially, and beautiful enough to feel like a genuine escape from their daily routines. They booked a cabin near the lake for a long weekend in early October 2021, choosing dates deliberately outside the peak summer season to avoid crowds. The cabin was one of several maintained by a private company that had held the lease for decades. Simple structures with wood paneling, stone fireplaces, and windows that offered panoramic views of the lake. The area around Lake Crescent has a reputation for being one of the most scenic locations in the Olympic National Park system, and photographs rarely do it justice. The lake is one of the deepest in Washington state, plunging to depths of over 600 feet in some locations. And the water is so clear that visibility can extend to depths of over 60 feet on calm days. Nathan and Stella arrived on a Friday afternoon, the autumn light already beginning to soften as they unpacked their bags and explored the cabin. The structure was exactly what they had hoped for. Rustic without being primitive, comfortable without being luxurious. The lake was visible from nearly every window, its surface smooth and dark blue, reflecting the steep forested hills that surrounded it on all sides. The cabins along the shore were spaced far apart, offering a sense of seclusion that felt like a luxury after years of apartment living in the city. They spent their first day hiking the Merrymere Falls Trail, a relatively easy walk through old-growth forest that terminated at a stunning waterfall cascading down moss-covered rocks. In the afternoon, they rented kayaks from the lodge and paddled along the shoreline, marveling at the clarity of the water and the way the light played across its surface. Everything was perfect in the way that vacations rarely are. The weather cooperating, their moods aligned, the beauty of the landscape exceeding even their elevated expectations. That night, they returned to their cabin for dinner, cooked steaks on the small grill outside, and settled in for a quiet evening by the fireplace. Around midnight, Nathan woke to complete silence. The experience was disorienting in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who has never encountered it. This was not the peaceful quiet of a remote location, the gentle background hum of wind through trees, or the distant calls of nocturnal animals. This was an oppressive, suffocating absence of sound, as though someone had wrapped the entire world in layers of insulation and cut off all connection to the living environment outside. Nathan sat up in bed, his heart already beginning to race, though he could not immediately identify why he felt so alarmed. Stella was also awake, sitting upright beside him, staring at the window. She turned to him and whispered, her voice sounding strange and small in the oppressive silence. "Do you feel that?" Nathan nodded, unsure what exactly she was referring to, but knowing instinctively that she was experiencing the same thing he was. The air in the cabin felt heavy, as though the atmospheric pressure had suddenly increased. It was difficult to breathe, each inhalation requiring more effort than it should, and a sense of overwhelming dread settled over them both like a physical weight. They heard nothing, but they both felt as though something was watching them from outside. It was not a vague sensation or an overactive imagination. It was a certainty, as undeniable as the temperature or the texture of the blankets they clutched in their hands. Nathan got out of bed slowly, moving as quietly as possible, though he could not have explained why stealth seemed important. He walked to the window and peered through the curtains, carefully, as though whatever was outside might notice the movement and react. The view from the window revealed nothing unusual. The lake was barely visible in the darkness, a slightly lighter shade of black against the surrounding forest. No lights, no movement, no indication that anything was out there at all. But Nathan could feel eyes on him, could sense a presence so strongly that his skin erupted in goosebumps, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood at attention. Stella suggested they lock all the doors and windows, which they did immediately, moving through the cabin as quietly as possible and checking every possible point of entry. The front door was already locked, as was the back door, but they tested them again anyway, needing the reassurance of feeling the resistance of the locks beneath their hands. The windows were more complicated. Several of them did not have locks, just simple latches that could be opened from outside if someone really wanted to. Nathan found himself testing each one multiple times, pushing against the frames to make sure they were secure, trying to calculate whether they would hold if something tried to force its way in. The rational part of his mind kept insisting that this was ridiculous, that there was nothing outside, that they were safe in a cabin maintained by a reputable company in a national park. But the primitive part of his brain, the ancient survival mechanisms that had kept human beings alive for millennia, was screaming that they were in danger. The hours between midnight and dawn were the longest of their lives. Nathan and Stella sat together on the couch, unable to sleep, unable to shake the sensation that something was waiting just outside. They spoke in whispers when they spoke at all, as though raising their voices might attract whatever attention they were trying to avoid. The silence persisted, that unnatural absence of sound that seemed to press against their ears and make them ring with phantom noises. Nathan kept checking his phone, watching the minutes crawl past with agonizing slowness, willing the sun to rise and break whatever spell had been cast over the cabin. At one point, perhaps around 2 or 3 in the morning, Nathan thought he heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow and deliberate, the creak of wood under weight moving from one end of the structure to the other. He looked at Stella, saw that she had heard it too, saw the fear in her eyes that he knew was reflected in his own. He stood and moved to the window again, looked out at the porch, and saw nothing. No person, no animal, no explanation for the sound they had both clearly heard. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving only that oppressive silence behind. Stella claimed she saw a shadow pass by the window later, a darker shape moving against the darkness outside. She grabbed Nathan's arm and pointed, but by the time he looked, there was nothing there. They remained frozen on the couch, holding each other, listening for sounds that never came, watching for movement that never materialized. The worst part was not knowing what they were afraid of, not being able to see or identify the source of their terror. If there had been a bear outside or a person trying to break in, at least they would have known what they were dealing with. But this was something else, something that existed just beyond perception, something that made itself known through absence rather than presence. When the first light of dawn finally broke, the oppressive silence lifted as suddenly as it had arrived. The change was instantaneous and dramatic, like someone flipping a switch. Birds began to sing, their calls tentative at first, and then growing in confidence and volume. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees and creating the soft background noise that Nathan and Stella had not realized they missed until it returned. The forest came back to life around them, and with it, the crushing weight of dread lifted from their chests. They could breathe normally again, could think clearly again, could move without feeling like they were being watched. Nathan and Stella packed their belongings immediately, moving quickly and efficiently, not discussing whether they would stay or leave because the decision was obvious to both of them. They were out of the cabin within 30 minutes, loading their car with hands that still shook slightly, glancing back at the structure as though expecting to see something standing in the windows or on the porch. The drive back to Tacoma was mostly silent. Both of them processing what they had experienced, both of them trying to make sense of something that defied rational explanation. They did not report the experience to the cabin owners or to park rangers, fearing they would not be believed or would be dismissed as tourists who had let their imaginations run wild. Who would believe that they had cut their vacation short because of silence, because of a feeling, because of an oppressive presence that left no physical evidence of its existence? They told their friends and family that the cabin had been disappointing, that the amenities had not met their expectations, vague complaints that discouraged further questions. To this day, Nathan and Stella do not know what caused the silent hours at Lake Crescent. They have researched the area extensively, looking for similar reports or historical incidents that might explain what they experienced. There are stories of disappearances around the lake, of course, as there are around most large bodies of water in remote areas. There was a famous murder in the 1930s. A woman whose body was found in the lake years after she went missing. But nothing they found matched the specific nature of their experience. The oppressive silence and the sense of being watched by something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. Both agree they will never return to Lake Crescent. The beauty of the lake, which had seemed so appealing in photographs and travel guides, is now tainted by the memory of that night. Nathan sometimes wakes in the middle of the night, momentarily disoriented, listening for the absence of sound that characterized those horrible hours. Stella has developed a habit of checking locks multiple times before bed, a behavior she never exhibited before their trip. They carry the experience with them, a shared trauma that has become part of their relationship in ways both spoken and unspoken. The forest around Lake Crescent continues to draw visitors who come for the hiking, the kayaking, the stunning views, and the promise of wilderness solitude. The cabins along the shore are booked months in advance during peak season. Nathan and Stella wonder sometimes if anyone else has experienced what they did, if other guests have felt that oppressive presence and that unnatural silence. They wonder if anyone would believe them if they shared the full truth of what happened. And they wonder, though neither of them voices this thought aloud. Whether whatever was outside that cabin is still there, still waiting, still watching for the next people who make the mistake of staying past midnight. Christian had grown up hearing stories about the forests around Snoqualmie Pass. His grandmother, who had been part of the Snoqualmie tribe, told him tales of spirits that lived in the old growth forests, guardians of the land who did not always take kindly to outsiders. She would sit with him on the porch of her small house on the reservation, speaking in a mixture of English and the Salish language that fewer and fewer people understood with each passing generation. She warned him never to disrespect the forest, never to take more than he needed, and never to wander alone after dark. The stories she told were not the sanitized versions found in children's books, but older tales, darker ones, with consequences that lasted lifetimes. Christian had always dismissed these stories as folklore, the kind of cautionary tales meant to keep children from getting lost in the woods or to preserve cultural traditions that might otherwise be forgotten. He was a practical person, someone who believed in things that could be measured and observed and explained through science. The supernatural had no place in his worldview, and he had spent most of his adult life gently but firmly disagreeing with his grandmother whenever she brought up the old stories. That changed in the winter of 2016. Christian was an avid snowshoer and often explored the backcountry trails around Snoqualmie Pass during the winter months. The area is easily accessible from Seattle, less than an hour's drive on Interstate 90, and offers hundreds of miles of trails that wind through forests and climb into alpine terrain. Christian had been snowshoeing in the area for years, had explored dozens of different routes, and felt comfortable with the terrain and the risks involved. One weekend in late January, he decided to hike a lesser-known trail that wound through a dense section of temperate rainforest before climbing into the alpine zone above. The forecast called for clear skies and moderate temperatures, perfect conditions for a solo day trip. Christian set out early in the morning, carrying only a day pack with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, extra layers, a headlamp, and the usual items he took on any backcountry excursion. The trailhead was nearly empty when he arrived, just one other car in the parking area, and he did not encounter any other hikers as he started up the trail. The forest was beautiful in winter, the trees heavy with snow, the silence profound in the way that only happens when fresh snow absorbs all sound. Christian felt at peace, enjoying the solitude and the physical exertion of moving through the snowy landscape. Several miles into the hike, Christian noticed something unusual: a set of tracks in the snow, running parallel to the trail but never crossing it. The tracks were humanoid in shape, but the stride was unnaturally long, as though whatever made them had been taking enormous steps. Each print was at least 4 feet from the next, far longer than any human could manage even running. Christian stopped to examine the tracks more closely. They were deep, indicating significant weight, and there was no sign of snowshoe or boot tread. Just smooth, elongated impressions in the snow, each one sinking down several inches into the powder. Curiosity got the better of Christian's usual caution. He had seen bear tracks before, elk tracks, even the occasional mountain lion print. These were different, and he wanted to understand what had made them. He decided to follow the tracks off trail, reasoning that he would only go a short distance and that he could always retrace his steps back to the maintained path. The tracks led him deeper into the forest, away from the trail and into a section of woods he did not recognize. The trees here were older, larger, and the canopy was so dense that very little snow had made it to the ground beneath them. The tracks became harder to follow, but Christian pressed on, convinced he was onto something unusual. After about 20 minutes of bushwhacking through the forest, the tracks led Christian to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. It was tall, easily 7 feet if not more, and appeared to be made of twisted branches and bark, as though it had grown directly out of the forest itself. The figure stood perfectly still, facing away from Christian, and for a long moment, he simply stared at it, trying to understand what he was seeing. His mind cycled through possibilities. An art installation, perhaps, or some kind of elaborate sculpture created by another hiker. But the clearing was miles from the nearest road, deep in backcountry that saw very little traffic. Then, slowly, the figure turned its head to look at Christian. The movement was deliberate and smooth. Not the jerky motion of something mechanical, but the fluid turn of something alive. The face was hollow, literally hollow. Where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only an empty void, a gaping hole that seemed to absorb the light around it. Christian felt a wave of primal fear wash over him, the kind of terror that bypasses rational thought and triggers every survival instinct the human body possesses. His heart began to race, his breathing became shallow, and his hands started to shake. Christian took a step backward, and the figure took a step toward him. It moved with an unnatural jerking motion, as though it were not accustomed to walking, as though the act of movement required conscious effort rather than automatic response. The sound of its footsteps was wrong too. Heavy thuds that seemed to shake the ground beneath Christian's feet. He did not wait to see what it would do next. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush and snow, desperate to find his way back to the trail. He could hear it behind him, the sound of branches snapping and the heavy thud of footsteps that shook the ground with each impact. Christian ran without thinking, without planning, guided only by panic and the desperate need to escape. Trees whipped past him, branches caught at his clothing and scratched his face, but he did not slow down. The sounds behind him grew louder, closer, and Christian was certain that whatever was chasing him would catch him at any moment. Then, suddenly, his feet hit the packed snow of the trail. The moment he crossed onto the maintained path, the sounds behind him stopped. Christian spun around, gasping for breath, and saw nothing. The forest was silent once more, peaceful and still, as though nothing had happened. He stood on the trail for several minutes, waiting for his heart rate to slow, listening for any indication that the figure was still out there. There was nothing. Just trees and snow and the gentle whisper of wind through the branches. Christian hiked out of the back country as fast as he could manage, practically running down the trail toward the trailhead. He did not stop to rest, did not pause to take photographs or enjoy the scenery. He just needed to get back to his car, back to civilization, back to a place where things made sense and creatures made of branches did not chase people through the forest. When he finally reached the parking lot, he threw his pack into his car and drove straight home without looking back. He has never spoken publicly about what he saw that day, fearing ridicule or disbelief. The rational part of his mind still tries to find explanations, still cycles through possibilities that might account for what he experienced. Perhaps it was a bear walking upright, and fear distorted his perception of its features. Perhaps it was another person in elaborate costume, playing a prank or conducting some kind of performance art. Perhaps it was hallucination brought on by dehydration or altitude or some other physical factor he had not accounted for. But Christian knows, in the same way that everyone who has encountered something genuinely inexplicable knows, that none of these explanations are true. What he saw in that clearing was not human and was not animal. It was something else, something that exists in the spaces between what we understand and what we refuse to acknowledge. He did call his grandmother after the incident, something he had not done in months. He apologized for not taking her warnings seriously, for dismissing the stories she had told him throughout his childhood as mere folklore or superstition. His grandmother was silent for a long time after he finished describing what had happened. Then she said simply that he was lucky to have made it back, that the Hollow Man was one of the old spirits, and that it did not tolerate trespassers in its territory. She told him that his ancestors had known these spirits, had respected them, and avoided the places where they dwelled. The fact that Christian had survived the encounter meant that the spirit had chosen to let him go, had allowed him to return to the human world with a warning rather than keeping him in the forest forever. Christian has not returned to Snoqualmie Pass. He sold his snowshoes and most of his winter camping equipment shortly after the incident, finding excuses whenever friends invited him on backcountry trips. He no longer dismisses the stories his grandmother told him as folklore or cultural mythology. He understands now that there are things in the forests of the Pacific Northwest that predate human habitation, spirits and entities that exist outside the boundaries of what modern science acknowledges as possible. The Hollow Man is real, or at least as real as anything can be when it exists in the liminal spaces between belief and experience. And Christian knows that if he ever ventures back into those old growth forests, if he ever steps off the maintained trails and into the territory where the old spirits dwell, he may not be allowed to leave a second time. Leah and Landon had been close friends since college and had made it a tradition to take an annual hiking trip together. The tradition had started almost accidentally during their sophomore year, when a planned group camping trip fell apart and only the two of them showed up at the designated meeting place. What could have been a disappointing weekend turned into one of the best experiences of both their lives, and they had repeated the ritual every year since. Sometimes other friends joined them, but more often it was just the two of them, escaping their busy lives in Portland for a weekend of trails and campfires, and the kind of honest conversation that only happens when you are miles from civilization. In the spring of 2022, they chose Cape Disappointment State Park, located at the southwestern tip of Washington, where the Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean. The park is known for its dramatic coastal cliffs, historic lighthouses, and dense coastal rainforest. It also has a darker history, having been the site of numerous shipwrecks over the centuries. The Columbia River Bar, the area where the river meets the ocean, has earned the nickname Graveyard of the Pacific, due to the treacherous conditions that have claimed hundreds of vessels and thousands of lives since the early days of European exploration. Leah and Landon arrived on a Friday afternoon, driving north from Portland in Leah's aging Subaru. The weather was overcast, which was typical for the region, and a thick fog rolled in from the ocean as evening approached. They set up camp at one of the park's designated sites, a small clearing surrounded by Sitka spruce and shore pine, close enough to the ocean that they could hear the constant roar of waves crashing against the cliffs below. The sound was both soothing and slightly unsettling, a reminder of the raw power of nature that existed just beyond their small circle of tents and camping gear. On their first night, after setting up camp and eating a simple dinner of freeze-dried meals and energy bars, Leah and Landon decided to hike one of the coastal trails. They were hoping to catch a glimpse of the sunset through the fog, though the visibility was so poor that it seemed unlikely. The trail wound through a section of coastal forest, with trees that had been shaped by constant wind into twisted, stunted forms. The sound of waves was a constant companion, sometimes loud and immediate, sometimes distant and muffled, depending on the terrain. About a mile into the hike, Landon stopped and pointed to something off the trail. It was a small, weathered wooden cross, half buried in the moss and ferns that carpeted the forest floor. There was no name or date carved into the wood, just the cross itself, gray and weathered by years of exposure to the elements. Leah suggested it might be a memorial for someone who had died in the area, perhaps a shipwreck victim or a hiker who had fallen from the cliffs. They took a photograph of the cross, both feeling slightly uneasy about disturbing what was clearly meant to be a memorial, and continued on. As they walked, Leah began to notice more crosses. They were scattered throughout the forest, dozens of them, all identical in size and shape. Some were barely visible, completely overtaken by vegetation, while others looked relatively new, the wood still retaining hints of its original color. Landon found it unsettling and suggested they turn back, but Leah was curious. She wanted to see where the trail led, wanted to understand why there were so many memorials in this particular section of forest. They pressed on, and the fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to only a few feet in any direction. The trail eventually opened up to a rocky overlook, offering what should have been a stunning view of the ocean far below. But the fog was so dense that they could barely see the water, only hear it. The constant roar of waves had become almost hypnotic, a white noise that seemed to fill every space in Leah's head. She walked to the edge of the overlook and looked down, trying to see through the fog to the beach below. That is when she saw them. Hundreds of crosses, planted along the cliffside, descending all the way to the beach below. They covered the entire slope, a silent forest of memorials stretching from where Leah stood all the way down to the waterline. The sight was overwhelming, both beautiful and deeply disturbing. Landon joined her at the edge, and they stood in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, both processing the sheer number of crosses and what they might represent. Leah pulled out her phone to take a picture, wanting to document this strange discovery. But the battery was dead. She looked at the screen in confusion, certain she had charged it fully that morning. Landon checked his phone and found the same thing. Both devices were completely drained, despite having been at full charge less than an hour earlier. The coincidence felt ominous, and Leah suggested they head back to camp. But as they turned to leave, she realized something that made her skin crawl. She could no longer hear the ocean. The constant roar of waves that had been their companion throughout the entire hike had stopped, replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence. Landon grabbed her arm and pointed toward the trail. Standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the fog, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing, possibly from the early 1900s. Dark coat, wide-brimmed hat, everything covered in a fine layer of what might have been salt or frost. The figure did not move, did not speak, just stood there watching them. Leah and Landon backed away slowly, moving along the cliff edge to avoid getting closer to the figure. As they moved, more figures began to emerge from the fog, surrounding the overlook. There were at least a dozen of them, all standing motionless, all watching. Each one was dressed in period clothing, each one gaunt and pale, each one standing with the same eerie stillness. Leah could feel panic rising in her chest, could hear Landon's breathing becoming rapid and shallow beside her. He whispered that they needed to run, and they did. They sprinted back down the trail, not caring about the uneven terrain or the roots and rocks that threatened to trip them. The figures did not follow, did not move at all, but Leah swore she could feel their eyes on her the entire time. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, branches whipping at her face, her lungs burning, her legs threatening to give out. Landon stayed close beside her, and neither of them looked back until they were well away from the overlook. They made it back to their campsite in record time, both of them gasping for breath shaking from adrenaline and fear. They did not discuss whether to stay or leave. Without speaking, they began packing their gear, throwing everything into their packs with no regard for organization. They were out of the campsite within 20 minutes, loading everything into Leah's car and leaving the park that same night. The drive back to Portland was mostly silent, both of them trying to process what they had seen, both of them afraid to voice their thoughts aloud. The following day, after a sleepless night, Leah tried to research the crosses she had seen. She searched online for information about memorials at Cape Disappointment, looked through historical records and park documentation, but could find nothing. There was no mention of hundreds of crosses on the cliffs, no explanation for what they might represent. She even called the park office to inquire, describing what she had seen as carefully as possible. The ranger she spoke with claimed there was no trail matching her description in that area of the park, no overlook where she described, no memorial site with crosses. Leah pulled up the park map on her phone, trying to trace the route they had taken. But the trail did not appear on any official documentation. It was as though the path they had hiked simply did not exist, according to the Park Service. She showed the map to Landon, who confirmed that he remembered the same route, the same landmarks. But according to every official source they could find, that section of the park did not have a maintained trail, and certainly did not have a memorial site with crosses. The photos they had tried to take were lost with their dead phone batteries, and when they recharged the devices later, there was no record of the images being captured. It was as though the entire experience had been erased, leaving only their memories as evidence that it had happened at all. Leah and Landon have not returned to Cape Disappointment, and both have agreed never to speak of what they saw that night except to each other. The memory of those figures standing in the fog, silent and unmoving, still haunts them. They wonder sometimes if the crosses represent the thousands of people who have died in shipwrecks along the Columbia River Bar over the centuries. They wonder if the figures they saw were the spirits of those lost at sea, forever trapped in the fog between the land and the water. And they wonder, though neither of them voices this thought, what would have happened if they had not run when they did? If they had stayed at that overlook surrounded by those silent watchers? The graveyard of the Pacific has claimed many lives over the years, sailors and passengers and crews who met their end in the treacherous waters where the river meets the ocean. Perhaps some of them never left, never moved on to whatever comes after death. Perhaps they remain there still, standing watch over the crosses that mark their passage, waiting for something or someone that will never come. Leah and Landon do not know the answers to these questions, and they are not sure they want to know. What they do know is that Cape Disappointment lives up to its name in ways that have nothing to do with the geography or the weather. It is a place where the boundary between the living and the dead seems thinner than elsewhere, where the past refuses to stay buried, where fog can hide things that should not exist but do. They have shared their story with a few close friends, always carefully, always watching for signs of disbelief or dismissal. Most people react with polite skepticism, suggesting they saw trees in the fog or that exhaustion played tricks on their minds. But Leah and Landon know what they saw was real. They carry the memory with them, a shared trauma that has changed the way they view the world and the places they choose to explore. Their annual hiking tradition continues, but they are more careful now about where they go, more aware that some places hold darkness that no amount of natural beauty can completely obscure. The Washington coast remains one of the most stunning landscapes in North America. But for Leah and Landon, it will always be tinged with the memory of that foggy evening when they stumbled into something that defied explanation and escaped with their lives.